Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. As we get started this evening, please be aware that this room is T-coil enabled. If you have a T-coil enabled device, feel welcome to turn it on at this time. If you don't have a T-coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, we have some available at the back of the room. You can just catch my attention or another PPL staff member and we'll bring it to you. In order for the system to work, it's important that everybody who's speaking do so into the mic. Our speakers will be speaking into the microphone, and we ask that any audience members who've been called upon to ask a question wait for us to bring you the mic. As I said, my name is Kim Dorman, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, an author talk with Christopher Eisgruber in conversation with Deborah Pearlstein. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us, both in person in our community and virtually on the live stream. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel. We're grateful to all of our university partners for their very thoughtful collaboration, particularly Melissa Mercuro for helping to coordinate. Sorry, I lost because that was an add-on thing to say. Thank you to Melissa. During the Q&A period, Professor Pearlstein will call on members of the audience who have their hands raised. A PPL staff member will bring you a microphone. And again, please remember to wait until we bring you the microphone before asking your question. I'm also pleased to share that President Eisgruber will be signing books until 7:30, at which point he needs to leave. And we're very grateful to our partners, Labyrinth Books, who are selling his book this evening. We know that this book has been hotly anticipated by our community, for no other reason than we have 30 holds on the copies that we have in the library. We are truly delighted to support this event by hosting. Please join me in welcoming the Princeton University Vice President for Communications and Government Affairs, Gadi Dechter.
Thank you, Kim. Good evening. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce your speakers this evening. Christopher Eisgruber is the 20th president of Princeton University, which he has led for more than a dozen years. He was previously Princeton's provost, which is a chief academic officer, for 9 years. President Eisgruber is a scholar and expert on constitutional law and the author of 4 books. His latest, which came out just 3 weeks ago, as Kim noted, is the topic of tonight's conversation, and that's Terms of Respect: How Colleges Get Free Speech Right. A 1983 graduate of the university where he majored in physics, President Eisgruber joined the Princeton faculty in 2001 after 11 years teaching at the New York University School of Law. Before becoming provost, he ran Princeton's program in law and public affairs at the School of Public and International Affairs. President Eisgruber is a graduate of the University of Chicago School of Law and a Rhodes Scholar. Deborah Pearlstein joined the Princeton faculty in 2023 as director of the Program on Law and Public Policy, or P-Law, which is the successor to the Princeton program run by President Eisgruber. Professor Pearlstein came to Princeton from the Cardozo Law School at Yeshiva University, where she was a law professor for 12 years. Her scholarship addresses the U.S. Constitution, international law, democracy, and national security. And like President Eisgruber, she's a former clerk for Justice John Paul Stevens at the U.S. Supreme Court. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Eisgruber and Deborah Pearlstein.
Let me first thank the library for hosting us and thank all of you for coming out this evening. I'm going to start off by reading a short passage from the book to give you a sense of the argument, and then Deborah and I are going to launch into conversation. Can I bring the sound up? Yeah, let me try here. Can you do it there? I'll do my best to be loud. Can you hear me now? There we go. Okay. Protest, agitation, and dissension are, on campuses or elsewhere, signs of civic distress. They occur when more orderly forms of discussion have broken down or proven unsatisfactory. They are also, however, something more positive. They are instances in which people are speaking up rather than remaining silent, advocating for their vision of justice and seeking change. That insight is essential to understanding the state of free speech on college campuses and the role of universities in American civic life. For example, some commentators regarded the Princeton protest about Woodrow Wilson as a threat to free speech and open inquiry on the campus. One lecturer at the university disparaged the protesters as, quote, crybaby fascists. Crybabies because they could not bear to see the university honor a historical figure whom they detested, and fascists because they wanted to stop the university community from using symbols and language that they found offensive. If such tender sensibilities were to determine the scope of permissible speech, according to this view, they would stifle the robust discussion essential to a good university or a free country. The protest had undeniably illiberal aspects. Using bullhorns to shout over people is awful behavior. Some of the protesters' demands, for example, that the university require all faculty to complete racial sensitivity training, were inconsistent with academic freedom. More generally, I wish the student protesters had chosen different means and different vocabularies to make their points. But none of that changes the fact that the protest was itself an exercise of free speech, one that raised important and previously ignored questions for public discussion. When alumni or others bemoan the alleged lack of free speech on college campuses, their complaints often focus not on the absence of speech, but rather on the presence of provocative or disrespectful speech with which they disagree. They say they want more speech, but their arguments suggest that what they want is for students to be more civil, polite, or collegial. Civility and collegiality are desirable goals, but they are different from less censorship or more free speech. Universities have a responsibility to elevate the conversation when valuable but uncivil speech occurs. After the sit-in at Nassau Hall, for example, Princeton formed committees to discuss issues raised during the protest, commissioned letters from historians about Wilson's legacy, and created in-person and online forums to encourage community input. What began as a rude and disruptive protest became an extended civil discussion that addressed topics about race, equality, and history, issues that are important to both Princeton and America, but are rarely discussed candidly in either. The student protesters were neither crybabies nor fascists. The university responded to them in a way that protected its commitments to both free speech and inclusivity. In the end, the episode was not a threat to free speech, but a powerful example of how free speech should work in a community dedicated to inclusivity, open discussion, and values-based decision-making. I want to convince you that these points apply more generally. By distinguishing carefully between genuine violations of free speech principles and controversial, upsetting exercises of it, we can more accurately assess the state of free speech on campuses and in our society. I argue that free speech on campus is far more robust than conventional opinion allows. Indeed, it is in better shape on campuses than in the rest of society, and it's stronger now in important respects than it was at colleges or elsewhere during the recent, more tranquil past. We will be better able to discern and address the real problems that threaten speech on campus. I argue that those problems affect our nation more broadly. They are neither unique to nor the creation of college students, Generation Z, faculty members, intellectuals, or any other cultural group. Today's young people are much like the rest of us. They want to engage with diverse viewpoints, and when they fail to do so, it's usually because of characteristics they share with the rest of American society. The challenges we face emanate from two distinct but overlapping sources: America's severe political polarization and the world's changed communication platforms, including the radical impact of online media. Those conditions affect all of us. America is confronting a genuine civic crisis. It is visible on, but neither confined to, nor caused by our college campuses.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Chris, thank you for doing that reading. It is really not only an honor, but just a delight to be able to sit here with you and talk about the book.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for doing this. It's great to have a conversation among two Stevens clerks.
I know.
About the state of the Constitution and our society.
He was just the most wonderful and attentive human being and thoughtful. And I think actually, come to think, a model of how to engage in civil and respectful dialogue in a host of ways, both
I agree,
in chambers and out, actually. So let's talk about your book, which is such a, not only incredibly timely, but such a relief from a lot of the writing in this space, which I think tends to the polemical and the sort of authoritative and conclusive. It recognizes a lot of complexities, right? So let me just start with that. That is, it's incredibly timely. You're writing at, you know, as well as anybody, this unbelievably difficult period in U.S. history in which the First Amendment and rights of speech and lots else is under enormous amount of stress. You clearly did not start writing this book when Jimmy Kimmel was suspended, right, from his talk show. When did you start thinking about writing this, and why? What was it that was the sort of impetus that led to it?
Well, the earliest seeds of this book were in an essay that I delivered as a speech at the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 2019, so about 6 years ago. I started writing in earnest for what would become the book about 3.5 years ago. And the reason, Deborah, was that I found myself often playing defense against various claims that were being made about free speech. And I wanted, if I could find the time to do it, both to think through what I believed about free speech on college campuses and to find an affirmative way of telling a story that I thought was much different than the one that dominates in the press. So from my standpoint, as I indicated in the passages that I read, I think the story about free speech on college campuses is by and large a pretty good story. There are incidents where colleges get things wrong, and we have to recognize those, respond to them, and do better. But there are also millions of conversations that take place every year on college campuses across America that contend with difficult subjects across differing opinions in ways that I think is rare in the rest of our society. So I felt like colleges were getting a bad rap, and I thought the book is dedicated to my students, and I mean that both in the sense of those that I've taught and those more broadly at our university, and I guess even more generally than that. I felt like the generation was getting a bad rap, right? People always like to complain about the younger generation, but the students that I encounter are students who, as I said, like the rest of us, want to deal with difficult ideas, but find it hard right now in a polarized, fractious society because it's hard for all of us. Mm-hmm. So that was the motivation for the book.
So that makes an enormous amount of sense. And you talk in the book in various chapters in various ways about the criticisms of speech on college campuses. You obviously mentioned some in the excerpt that you read. A lot of these criticisms have come from the right. They include accusing colleges of censoring and canceling conservative speakers, students shouting down conservative speakers. You mentioned the example from Stanford Law School, which was not that long ago, where students shout down to sort of a federal judge in protest who's there on campus to speak. And then at the same time, you mentioned left-leaning student groups demanding the removal of offending perspectives from course syllabi, including here at Princeton. It's a lot. I mean, isn't some of this criticism sort of well-placed?
Well, some of it's well-placed, right? So if you think about what happened with Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford, that's one of the incidents that often gets repeated and referred to. I think around 2023 was the year for that one, and the students made it impossible for him to deliver his lecture, and to make matters worse, an administrator got up and instead of putting out the flames, she kind of threw gasoline on them. So that's terrible, right? And when there's a problem like that, it should be recognized. That's real censorship. It made it impossible for a speaker that some people on the campus wanted to hear to be heard, and that should be recognized. It's really important to say that Stanford recognized it immediately. So Jenny Martinez, who was then the dean of the law school and is now the provost of the university, immediately apologized along with the president of the university to Judge Duncan. She put out a good letter to the entire Stanford Law School student body explaining freedom of speech. She set up procedures and educational initiatives to make sure that the incident would not recur. So I think Stanford it took the blame there and should have taken the blame for something going wrong, but then did a number of things that were right. I think that gets mushed together then with all sorts of things like the Woodrow Wilson controversy here at Princeton that are quite different and are actually a part of exercises of free speech. So, you know, when you talk about students claiming that a certain person should not have been invited to campus, right? Frequently, those are controversies that are alluded to. I don't think universities should rescind the invitation, right? Once you invite somebody to campus, the speech should go forward, but it's perfectly okay. It is not in itself a violation of free speech for students to say, hey, that particular person should not have been invited to our campus, and sometimes they might be right about that. That is an entirely legitimate conversation to have. So part of my problem with the account that gets given of what happens on college campuses is effectively controversy gets coded as censorship. The Kyle Duncan episode, that was really censorship. He wasn't able to deliver his remarks and people weren't able to hear him. But if there's controversy about a speaker, if a bunch of students are saying, first of all, that person shouldn't have been invited, and then they're protesting the speech, but they're not disrupting it, that's not a problem. And often it gets measured or cited as a problem.
So that actually makes me want to back up and ask, you know, and I consider this fair game because you were a constitutional law professor, but also it's in your book, so it's totally fair game.
Totally
right?
fair game.
I want to ask you, right, what we mean by free speech, or what the, you know, how the Constitution has been interpreted to provide for free speech, and the sort of model that you give, and it informs a huge amount of First Amendment doctrine today, right, is Brandeis's view in Whitney. So maybe you could like tell us and just remind us what that case was about, or what Brandeis's view was about what the First Amendment says about how to handle hate speech and, you know, false speech, people who lie, and, you know, bad speech in a variety of ways.
Yeah, so look, I'll start to give the short course here in constitutional law, and you'll cut me off. Yeah,
I will cut you off.
If it starts to go on too long. But lots of people, I mean, I think maybe the best known phrase about the free speech in American constitutional law comes not from Brandeis, but from Oliver Wendell Holmes. And the way it gets quoted, it's not exactly what he said, but is that we want to protect the marketplace of ideas. I don't really like that formulation of the free speech ideal. I much prefer Justice Louis Brandeis from Whitney versus California in 1927, where he concurred. He actually upheld the prosecution of somebody who was being prosecuted for political speech. But he had these really important ideas in the opinion. And part of what he said was that as long as there's time for education to remedy the effects of bad speech, the right remedy for bad speech isn't censorship, it's more speech. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the basic idea is the remedy for bad speech is more speech. But the reason I like Brandeis better than Holmes is that Brandeis didn't just say, well, it's the marketplace, so that speech should all be out there and whatever sells is great. That's kind of the marketplace idea. Brandeis said, the reason we care about free speech is because it allows us to improve our faculties. It allows deliberative opinions to prevail over the arbitrary, and that process requires free speech. And he also said it makes sense for a courageous and self-reliant people. He recognized that it's not just if you're a bunch of consumers and you're out there, free speech is a good thing. It requires certain kinds of character traits, and I think that becomes more and more apparent in the circumstances where we're living now?
Well, so, I mean, that gets to the question, right? So
Okay.
Brandeis says the cure for bad speech is more speech,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's people lying, disinformation, misinformation, or hate speech or offensive speech of any kind. And in the last decade plus, right, that notion, I think, is being challenged increasingly. Like, we have a glut of speech. We now know what it means to have sort of infinite speech. Everybody has a platform, and it is not at all clear that truth will out in this sort of universe, whether that's our failing, whether that's the failing of social media companies or gaming platforms or podcasts or whatever. We are inundated, and the students are inundated with speech. Is that a model? You know, we have, as you mentioned in your book, the most speech protective constitution in the world, right? Is that a model that still makes sense?
Yeah. So look, it's never been clear that free speech will produce the kinds of results that Brandeis wanted it to produce, which is, again, something I like about his opinion, that unlike Holmes, he doesn't just say, hey, if there's an unregulated marketplace, we're in good shape. He says there are certain kinds of objectives, and we need lots of things, including things like courage and self-reliance from people. But even at the time he was writing this, Walter Lippmann was saying some of the same things that you just said, Deborah, that what's happening with mass media at that time meant that people might be manipulated in some way. Can we really count on debate to produce the kinds of results that we want? So I think it's never been clear. I continue to believe in what Brandeis said, and just to put another case into the mix here, I think the really important case was New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964, which is the case that first really gives teeth to Brandeis's ideas and puts into place the kind of regime around libel law that we have today, where with complete clarity about this, the Supreme Court says we are going to have a discourse that is robust and even caustic. But it says this, and they're really clear when we get to Times versus Sullivan, that the reason we want to have this incredibly broad set of rights of free speech is because the alternative is censorship, and then you've got to trust the censors, right? And who do you want to trust? The current federal government, your local governments, the local governments, not only here but everywhere else. You want to trust me on a college campus? I don't want to be trusted to be censoring speech and deciding what speech is good and what's not. So we have this incredibly broad set of rights that, in my view, is predicated on the idea that it's better than the alternative, right? Like most things in government, it's the old Churchillian phrase about democracy. It has lots of problems. It's just better than all the alternatives to it. Likewise, with the free speech rights we have, and then an important part of this, you do need regulations around time, place, and manner that say things like, you know, you can't just use a bullhorn in a residential neighborhood to express what it is you have to say. And last thought about this, you need all sorts of other structures in society that help to bring about the kinds of ideals that Louis Brandeis was talking about. So things like this, right? This is a public library. We have free speech, but we also have institutions that help to curate ideas, which is what a library does. It's what a university does. It's what many of our civic associations do. So I think Brandeis, again, unlike Oliver Wendell Holmes, I guess I keep picking on Holmes. But
No, you can pick on him.
I can pick on Holmes,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, but Brandeis recognizes you've got to have these other things, and that's part of what this book is about. You need those other things, those civility rules in order to enable us to succeed.
So let me do one more beat on these other things,
Okay.
right? Because one of the problems that, at least as a teacher, right, both when I was a teacher in law school and here, you know, I worry most about, and you talk about this in your book, is self-censorship, right, is chilling effect, including, and maybe especially including amongst students. You cite this amazing statistic, a 2020 study, political scientists did survey research, and they found that 46% of Americans feel less free to speak their minds than they used to be, right? That's how they answer the question. That's in contrast to 13.4% of people who said they felt less free to speak their minds during the height of the Red Scare.
Yeah.
Right? Is this the larger, right? So that people are worried about saying something controversial, saying something offensive in classrooms and so forth. Is this the speech problem on campus? And if so, what should we do about it as teachers?
I think it is one of the speech problems in America, and therefore it is a speech problem on campus. So let me just say a few things about self-censorship. First of all, I got crazy about polls that just ask people whether they self-censor. We all self-censor, right? We've occasionally met people who don't self-censor. That's an issue. I mean, there was one poll that said 80% of university presidents self-censor about political subjects sometimes, and I was thinking, how do the other 20% keep their jobs, right? It's a part of adult life that you're going to self-censor. But the poll you quoted there, which I do cite in the book, says we self-censor more now, and we all self-censor more often on political subjects. I think that's true, and I think it's true. I argue in the book for a couple of different reasons. One is the high level of political polarization within our society right now. So there's a lot of data around political polarization, which is quite sobering when you read it. But here's one statistic that I particularly find gripping on this, which comes out of a poll that Johns Hopkins did about a year ago. About half of Republicans and likewise half of Democrats think that people in the other political party are downright evil. That's the phrase that was used in the poll. 50% of Republicans think that Democrats are downright evil. And conversely, 50% of Democrats think that Republicans are downright evil. Now, if you know that there is a significant probability that somebody may judge you to be downright evil if you disclose your political views to them, you have an incentive to self-censor, right? If I haven't met you before, I don't know what it is you think. I'm talking to you. I'm going to be very careful about the impression that I make given those kinds of odds. So polarization is one thing that has this effect. A second is social media, right? I don't think that's going to surprise anybody in the room, but now all of a sudden you say something and there's a risk that what you say could go viral and live forever on the internet. And I think both of those, and maybe especially the latter one, affect our students. So when I taught a freshman seminar during the pandemic on free speech to a group of first-year students at Princeton, I was asking them, well, how do what do you experience? Are you able to have these conversations or not? And what they talked about, the place where they found a real problem, wasn't in the classrooms, it was in their discussions with their peers. And they did feel a concern about self-censoring there. And that is a serious worry for us, and I think for society more broadly. For most of us, I would say, and I actually see one of my senior year roommates here in the in the room right now, but he knows that there were lots of times when we were having conversations in the dorm room, and aside from his memory, right, my dumb remarks, of which I made many, don't say anything, Paul. Yeah. But my dumb remarks, right? They Paul or somebody else would say to me, Chris, that's silly. You can't say those things.
Paul, if you have a comment later, no, I will call on you. So, but well, I'm sorry, Grace. Yeah.
Yeah. But nowadays those late night bull sessions are fraught for the students. Sorry, that was long.
No. I got it, and also interesting because behind the scenes. So that's great. Okay. So let me just then pick up with the last piece of that question, which is, the dynamics you're describing, certainly political polarization, the rise of social media, the information ecosystem more broadly, these are problems and dynamics that massively transcend the university space, right? So if the impact they're having is on students who are afraid to express themselves to fellow students, maybe also in the classroom, I suppose, depending on what kind of classroom it is, but either way, how much can universities actually do to combat that, right? I worry as a teacher, I worry about as much as anything about who is not speaking, right? And in law school, at least in the first year, we solved that problem by calling on people, cold calling on people. Like laws, this is famous. We can talk about this later if folks want, but right, students find that a deeply mixed blessing. But I actually think at this current moment, it's got its virtues maybe more than its values. Are there ways undergraduate institutions, teachers or otherwise, should be reconfiguring their classrooms, thinking about teaching, thinking about the kind of speakers they bring in, I don't know, or the kinds of settings they create for students to combat this? Or is there really not that much universities as such can do?
I think there's lots that universities can do around this, although it begins from recognizing, what I think we're not going to be able to do is cure the problem, right? If people think that we can make the incentives that come with social media or political polarization go away, I would love that, but I don't think that's happening. I think both effects are with it. So what we have to do is teach and model skills that are useful for that environment. And again, we have to do it recognizing that the principal problems right now are not in the classroom, but here are some of the things that faculty members are doing. So actually, I agree with you about cold calling, and one has to be careful about how one scaffolds it, so to speak, in a classroom. If you're going to do it with undergraduates, you have to introduce it in the right way, and you have to practice it relatively gently, but I think it's important. I think you have to send signals in lots of different ways that diverse views are welcome in the classroom. I think a lot of faculty now do that in their syllabi, and they lay out their expectations for how discussion is going to take place. I heard a great story from a Princeton parent a month or so ago when I was talking about some of these subjects, who said they had a son, I think last semester, in a class being taught by Matt Desmond, who has a reputation for being on the political left and talking about housing. The son was a conservative student and was wondering after a couple of classes, well, should I really be here in this classroom? I'm going to be welcome. Professor Desmond, unprompted, walked up to him and said, I am so glad that you are in this classroom. I want you to continue speaking up. You're really benefiting the class discussion. I mean, faculty members who can intuit things like that make a big difference. And I think we have to teach, and again, I have a lot of respect here for the current generation. I think 10 years or so ago, students like all of us were being kind of hammered by this wave of social media and didn't quite realize what it was doing to all of us. Now I think they're pretty savvy about it, but I think we can be teaching them about how to communicate in ways that are a little more, resilient against this kind of viral effect. So as you kind of noted in your opening remarks, the book is an effort to do that. I'll tell you this, there are a lot of university presidents who self-censor right now by not talking about controversial topics about free speech and academic freedom. I believe there are ways that you can do that, but in order to do it, you have to know how to be civil. You have to know how to be respectful to people with whom you disagree, and teaching that to our students, it's the snarky provocations that are most likely to get you in trouble.
Could you please call your next book Snarky Provocations? Just because of
it would disappoint the readers. I'm not good at
that. But since you went there, I was going to go there anyway. But I want to come back to where we are now, right? And universities, all apart from the criticism that universities were getting, that you discuss in the book and that we've talked about here, universities have been on the receiving end of not just, grant terminations, but sometimes more direct demands from the current administration, right? And it was 2 weeks ago now, I'm going to lose track. A lot happens quickly. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the administration issued this sort of proposed compact that it sent to 9 or 10 different schools, I think not Princeton, but 9 or 10 really wonderful schools in the United States, lesser than Princeton, but still.
Great schools, actually.
Yeah, needed to
fantastic
just to back
schools.
up a little bit, right? And they said, the deal was you will be given funding preferences of various kinds from the federal government if you agree to the following, and it was like a 10-page set of demands, which included, don't belittle conservative ideals. Or ideas, don't belittle conservative, in other words, don't criticize conservative ideas, I think, among other things. You mentioned wishing universities and your fellow universities presidents would say more. How would you hope the universities respond to that? What's the right response? How much courage does it take right now?
Well, what I would say is 6 out of the 9 universities that received that letter have now written back, and I think in very polite and respectful ways said to the Secretary of Education, we want to work with you around ideals that we share, and we think there are many of those, but we cannot sign this document, and we cannot sign it because of basically two reasons, and not all of them have mentioned both of these reasons, but most of them have. They've pointed out that the document would make the award of sponsored research funding contingent not on the merit of the research projects, but on fidelity to a particular political agenda, which is inconsistent with the set of principles that have made American research universities the best in the world. And I would add is inconsistent with the administration's own insistence on merit in academia. So they've highlighted that point. And the second point they've highlighted is that the proposed compact is inconsistent with academic freedom, which is another pillar of excellence within American research universities. So from my standpoint, and I've said this publicly, I was not asked by the Department of Education to offer my views about the letter, but I have done so anyway. And my views are exactly that. The strength of American universities, as I said in the Atlantic last spring, depends on both academic freedom and this partnership that has existed between the government and our research universities for a period of more than 70 years now across both Democratic and Republican administrations, which has sponsored research in the interests of the American people while also protecting academic freedom. Both of those two things are fundamental. We have to insist on them. And I'm really proud that we've now seen 6 different university presidents from different institutions, beginning with, I would say, the quite extraordinary Sally Kornbluth at MIT, but six different university presidents say that to the government in a very respectful way that says, look, we want to find ways to work together with you.
So for a long time, it felt like, to me, right, you had that piece in the Atlantic some months back now, I think, when this was all started. You gave an interview to the New York Times. This was even before your book came out, right? Really challenging some of what some of exactly these kinds of attacks. I was disappointed then that more university presidents weren't speaking out. Why do you think that they didn't? And have you worried about self-censorship? Have you, or not worried about self-censorship, have you felt like, yeah, before I hit publish on this, should I be doing it? Like, how much have you worried about, either for yourself or more broadly, consequences of speaking at this moment?
Yeah. So here's what I would say about this, which is, first of all, I respect my fellow university presidents tremendously, and I realize that all of them are dealing with different settings, different sets of pressures, different communities, different missions, different financial circumstances from the ones that I deal with. So I'm hesitant to pass judgment on decisions made by others. These are real. It's hard to be a university president in any times. It's especially hard to be a university president today. I will say that I think it's essential to be speaking up right now. I hope that more university presidents will join me in doing that. As I said, I have great admiration for the 6 who have spoken up and I think said things that are accurate and true in response to this compact, and so maybe that's a good sign. The other thing I would add, and it kind of connects to the back half of your question, is I certainly lost a few nights' sleep before the Atlantic article came out because I didn't know what the reaction or the consequences would be. I realized that in publishing it, I had to think not only about the consequences for me, but the consequences for a community that's represented in part here and that embraces a huge number of different people on the campus across Nassau Street. And I had to think very seriously about what risks I might be subjecting that campus to. But part of what you do as a leader when you speak up and say what it is you think is you authorize, invite, and license other people to tell you what it is they're thinking. So the community speaks as well. And what I have heard from the Princeton community is extraordinarily strong support for these principles that we have articulated. And I think we have a unity in the community that is rare and that helps us tremendously as a university, and it helps me as I get that feedback to make other decisions going forward. And part of what I have said to some of my counterparts is look, when you speak up this way, yes, it has tactical risks associated with it, but frankly, I think there are also risks to being silent. And in my view, the risks of being silent are, they may be slower in character, but they're almost more certain to produce bad consequences. And there are benefits to speaking up because of what it makes possible as one goes forward.
I will say, selfishly, I think your speaking up makes it easier for faculty to speak up, makes it easier for students probably as well.
Certainly faculty have spoken up. I had the unique experience of having a couple of students chase me across a courtyard after the Daily in the New York Times to tell me they were really proud of what I said. That doesn't happen to university presidents every day.
So. I don't recall ever doing that when I was a student. So I'm conscious of the time, and we want to be sure to allow you folks to ask questions. So let me ask one last, and then we'll, if it's okay, take some questions from others. We've talked already a little bit. I mean, you have in your book multiple sort of references to when things like this have happened before in history. I don't just mean like at Stanford a couple of years ago, but the Red Scare, talk certainly about the incredible importance of the civil rights movement in creating the free speech doctrine at the court that we have today in the First Amendment, and other examples in your book. Have you found that kind of sort of historical perspective or historical research or reading comforting at this particular moment? I will say, just for myself, I find myself just reverting to historical reading, relevant historical reading, but increasingly, in part for the psychological, both the intellectual insight, but what feels to me like the psychological comfort it brings. I don't know if you felt that way as well, or not.
I do, actually. I don't know, maybe this is another thing we share in our DNA as Stevens clerks or something else, but particularly over the last couple of years, I've spent some of my summers reading memoirs and biographies of university presidents who lived through the 1960s and early 1970s. I see some heads nodding because actually part of the point that I make in the book is whatever the tumult looks like on college campuses right now, it still isn't what it was from about 1968 to 1971, when a lot of presidents lost their jobs in the United States and when there was real violence on college campuses and real disorder in our society. So I've read Clark Kerr, the University of California president, who was quite extraordinary, his memoirs, and Jeffrey Cabaservis's book about Kingman Brewster at Yale. There are probably not 30 holds on either of those two volumes if they're actually in the library, because memoirs and biographies of university presidents are not necessarily the most sought after books. But I will tell you, they've done exactly, I didn't come out of those feeling like, aha, here's the solution. But I did find myself feeling, all right, these people were going through something very similar to what it is that I've experienced. And it was comforting to read these reflections of Clark Kerr in particular, who was just an extraordinary president, but felt utterly without options as he dealt with some of the protests on the University of California campus in 1964.
That actually makes me want to go read that now, although read his book first. Okay,
yes,
so
please.
Let's take some questions if anybody has one, or right here in the front row we can start maybe.
So thank you, President Eisgruber. As a lifelong educator, I want to thank you for first writing your essay to Atlantic and then interview with NPR and New York Times, for standing up for America, for American higher education, for freedom of speech, but most important of all, for democracy. Because without freedom of speech, there is no democracy. So thank you very much for that. Secondly, thank you for bringing this book to our attention at this critical moment, even though you didn't intend that way 3.5 years ago when you started, but it came out at a very, very critical moment in our country. my question or my curiosity is, throughout your book, you talked a lot about the Constitution protection for freedom of speech. But your real message for me in the book is the second one. It's the title of the book, which is Civil Guardrails, Unwritten Laws that can guarantee our rights to be actually actualized. Because law only gives you the right to do so. It doesn't protect you to be heard. It gives you right to speak. But if everybody speaks at once, no one hears anything, then there is no freedom of speech. So my curiosity is, you use the word terms, and I actually spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out what that means. And it led me to think about Aristotle's comments about sort of showing respect.
So before you start with Aristotle, let me take the question, if I can. Because, right, I mean, this is, I think I took similar things from the book. What are the terms of civility the terms of respect that you are envisioning here? What do we do in not just university campuses? Does this translate more broadly?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the question, and thank you for the way you put a couple of things in the question. First of all, I appreciate your comments about the interviews and advocacy that I've done, and I conceive it exactly as you described, not about being for or against any particular political administration, but rather standing up for education, standing up for the values that define the Constitution and that define our democracy. And I think one should be able to do that without thereby becoming unduly partisan. And I do very much appreciate your attention to this idea of terms of respect, because you're absolutely right. One of the things I want to call attention to is, yes, the history of free speech, but then the indispensable character of having civility norms that enable us to do the things that Brandeis hoped for. So as you accurately say, freedom of speech could be fully met and satisfied if everybody were just shouting insults at one another. There would be lots of free speech, but there would be no learning, no constructive deliberation, and no improvement of our faculties. And in order to get there, we need all sorts of different things, which I refer to either as civility rules or the terms of respect, that enable us to have actually constructive conversations. And some of those things I alluded to earlier. I mean, they include things like polite manners. I mean, the ability to say please and thank you to people and to address them in ways that are respectful and not to, for example, lapse into stereotypes that insult people. Those are all part of the kind of tools that we need in order to be able to have conversations with one another. But we also need more than that. So I mentioned libraries and universities earlier on, but also a kind of a substantive set of understandings in a very diverse society. And this has been America's challenge throughout its history, right? The political theorists of the 18th century thought that a democracy on the scale of the United States was impossible, because even at the time that the United States was founded in the 18th century, they thought we were too diverse, so that one needed, in order to have a true republic, to have a greater homogeneity of people, so you didn't have these problems of coming together across diverse views. So I think one needs those conventions that enable us to respect one another. But Deborah, to your question, I think those are things that I can't just say what they are, right? I try to indicate, I think, that lots of the things that get criticized today, for example, work around diversity and inclusion, which I think is extremely important to civility, right, helps to build that kind of respect. But we are inevitably going to have arguments about what the terms of respect are. They're negotiable. They aren't set and fixed, yes, by the law or Supreme Court doctrine. And part of what gets people upset is when protests, including the one over Woodrow Wilson on this campus, take place, they are contesting the terms of respect, right? Is holding Woodrow Wilson out as an iconographic example of what it is to be a statesman a good way to teach respect? or does it undermine respect given his history of racism? And I don't think one can just stipulate an answer to that. I think it has to be argued out. And so that's part of the argument of the book.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir. Right, no, right here, yes. I'm sorry. Blue jacket.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. Your opening was very powerful. You said that protests are a sign of civic distress. So I have a concern. There are countries where this civic distress cannot be manifested. One of these countries is the Republic of China. And we know that several manifested this distress are basically in jail. We have a large community of students, Chinese students. We have a large community of Chinese faculty. We have a large community of Chinese or American Chinese donors. So is the lack of, how can I say, enforcing some ethical restriction on all the money that is coming in some way, direct or indirect, from the Republic of China, a sign of a kind of self-censorship? It's easy to speak about free speech, it's easy to speak about freedom and democracy, but definitely, why don't we give the example? Why we accept money coming from a country which is a dictatorship? This seems to be a dissonance in all the nice talks, because sometimes what you do is more important than what you say.
Yeah. Well, so let me just say, first of all, I actually don't think it's that easy to speak about free speech or democracy, which is why I wrote the book, to explore some of the complexities. But I take the point that there are practical problems that arise. I don't want to comment, and I don't understand your question to be about what's happening in China per se. That goes a little beyond the boundaries of what it is I'm discussing here. But there is this concern about what happens when Chinese students come to the United States, and do they feel the shadow, in a way, of the Chinese government trying to restrict what it is they say? Is that the question that you're asking? Am I correct about that? No.
Chinese donors, I think.
Chinese donors. Why are we taking the money? Just, well, quickly, if you're going to add to it, just.
I was concerned with the other way around. We can do very little for Chinese nationals. Yes, I agree. We can do very little for Chinese nationals coming or staying in China, but we can do a lot to implement, to enforce ethical guidelines or ethical mechanism, actual mechanism, to be sure that, for example, the money that supports university with tuition, with donation, is actually not linked to any practice that we may not recognize in a free democratic regime, forced labor.
Okay, so let me try that. So it is about the funding, and I think there are two kinds of issues about funding, right? So one issue is whether or not funding has strings of some kind attached to it. And neither of these two issues, by the way, is specific to China. They're issues that occur with regard to funding from all kinds of different sources, including American donors. But one issue about funding is making sure that there are no strings that are inconsistent with the principles of the university. So that's something we have to do. Again, whether this compact is actually an example of that, whether the money is coming from the federal government, whether it's coming from sources in China, whether it's coming from individual donors in the United States, people sometimes try to put limitations on what it is the university can do. And part of my job is to make sure that those limitations are not there when we accept gifts. It's much more important for us to be able to assert the academic freedom and to continue to have the freedoms that are essential to a university as we go forward. The second question that I think can recur without regard to whether the money is coming from China or somewhere else is whether or not the sources of the funding are in some way inconsistent with the values of the university. Is this money that we should not take because it represents the ill-gotten gains of some kind of activity, that is fundamentally inconsistent with the values of the university. We have processes and judgments around that too, because we want to be careful. I think one can easily start generalizing that kind of judgment too far, but we do want to be careful not to accept that kind of funding. But none of that means that the universities should never be taking money from China, or that we should generalize about any other set of sources. There are gifts that may be consistent with the two principles and restrictions that I just set out coming from China, and there may be gifts coming from the United States that are inconsistent with those principles. So that's what I would look to.
Yeah, thank you. Is there one last question? Yes, sir. If you can keep the question relatively brief, we'll have time for an answer. No.
Last year, we witnessed some political protests on Raucous Green due to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And there were people both from a Palestine point of view and Israeli point of view, all kind of mingling in a civil way, which I think corresponds to your ideals. But this year, it's been quiet. The protesters seem to have been intimidated. And maybe this is an example of self-censorship. And if so, is that a healthy change for the university?
Well, I think there are many different reasons that go into determining when students choose to protest or not. My responsibility is to make clear what the values and rules are that apply to protest on the campus, not to decide whether or not protests are going to happen. That really has to be the choice of the students. And the values that I emphasize are, first of all, some of the ones that we discussed, right? That it's very important to have engaged discussion about difficult topics, including Israel-Gaza, for example, that we are going to accord broad rights of free speech, and we didn't really get into the parameters of those, but under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and under the Chicago Principles on Free Speech, which we've adopted, students and others have tremendous freedom to say things that others deem to be immoral, offensive, wrong-headed. So we don't censor the content, even though there are people asking me on both sides of the issue to do so. We don't censor the content of what they put on their signs or what it is that they say. But there also have to be time, place, and manner rules that regulate how you do that, so that, again, people are able to interact on terms of respect and go about their educational business. The kind of political equivalent in Washington is you have more freedom in this country to say nasty things about political officials than just about any place else in the world. But you cannot go down to Washington and spray paint your message on the Washington Monument. You cannot occupy the lobby of the Commerce Department, and you cannot pitch a tent encampment without a permit on the National Mall. So we have to have the same kinds of rules, and one can debate what they are, but those rules are essential to allowing people to engage in the kinds of conversations that happen on a college campus. So my job is to make all that clear. It's my job to enforce the rules. Students make different kinds of decisions, and we see this back in the 60s and 70s as well about when they're protesting and when they're not. I want to say one last thing about this because, again, it's really important to the place we started and about what's happening on college campuses and how it relates to the impressions people have. People always talk about the protests around this, right? Here are the protests. Are the protests happening? Are the protests not happening? Are the students out with signs about Israel-Gaza, or are they not out about signs? That is about 1%. It may be about 1% of what happens on a college campus, right? It's at least 99% that is about the scholarship and the teaching that goes on in our classrooms and in our libraries and in our laboratories. And from my standpoint, there is a complicated problem right now in the Middle East and lots of other complicated problems all over the world. The most important thing is that our students are engaging around those subjects. We have to leave them with the freedom to protest. But what really would get me worried is if they were choosing not to engage with those subjects through the multiple classes that we offer on the topics, if they were not writing about those subjects. And I think they're continuing to do all those things. And that doesn't mean that one shouldn't have protest. I began by saying one should. But the most important thing about what goes on college campuses is that teaching and research mission, and it continues with great vitality.
That actually is the perfect place to land us. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the wonderful
Great, thank you.
conversation.
Thank you, Deborah. That was great. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.